How's everybody doing tonight? It's always, okay, I just have to get into a little pastor thing here. Whenever we ask how it's doing tonight, if you guys don't immediately respond like big, you're in danger of a very specific thing, which is the pastor asking, I'm not going to do it to you, okay? I'm cool. But you're in danger of the pastor asking, I can't hear you, okay? So I'm just warning you. It's on you guys to answer for like the first time with a lot of energy. So anyways, that's a slight bit of housekeeping. I'm just kidding. I want to just start off by reading the text that we're going to go through today. We're in a series on spiritual disciplines. And so we've talked about community, we talked about fasting, we talked about prayer, and tonight we're going to talk about Sabbath. So I'm going to read a text here. And this is what it says. Jesus was going through the grain fields on a Sabbath, and his disciples began to pick some heads of wheat as they made their way. So the Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what's against the law on the Sabbath? He said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God when Abiathar was the high priest and he ate the sacred bread, which is against the law for anyone but the priest to eat, and he also gave it to his companions. And then he said this to them, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. For this reason, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Just look at those words there. The Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. That's going to be pretty important with what we're going through tonight. So I'm just going to pray real quick, and we're going to talk about this today. So, Lord, thank you so much for everything that you have given us, and you have said that you made the Sabbath for us. And so I just pray that as we talk tonight, that you would reveal to us in whatever unique way that we need it, that it really was made for us. In your name, amen. So is Mal here tonight? You're here, Mal? No, okay, good, because I have a bone to pick with her. There's, if you don't know Mal, she's a new student here, and she's just graduated from college, and she was singing with us at Anthem on Saturday mornings, and I come into the room, and she goes, hey, Unc. I was like, what? And she's like, yeah, it's like, because you're old, right? And she said, it's so chill. I've never felt older in my entire life. And so I figured today I'd share some of the 32 years of wisdom that I have with you. It's a lot, obviously. I'm an Unc now. But a lot of it could be distilled down into this quote that I saw recently, which is here. It's by this guy named H.H. Farmer. He's a philosopher and a minister. He says, if you go against the grain of the universe, you get splinters. Talking about like when you rub your hand down a piece of wood, if it's against the grain, you might get splinters. And he means by that the universe is built a certain way. It just is. It's built a certain way. And if you try to go against that, you're going to end up feeling it, right? Unfortunately for us, in our origin story as humans, we decided to go against the grain. We decided that the one who made the universe, that he wasn't trustworthy. And so we decided that we were trustworthy ourselves enough to decide what was good and what wasn't good. And so we decided to go our own way. And we trusted ourselves, and we've been getting splinters ever since. The wild thing about it, and the plot twist to this whole story, is that the one who made the universe, the one we decided was untrustworthy, that guy, he stayed consistent to himself. And out of his utter kindness, his heart of utter kindness, he decided to go about the really long process and the slow process of proving himself to us as people. And he did that for literally thousands of years before he finally just showed up himself, said, this is who I am. And then what's crazy, he was still consistent to himself in doing that. He's consistent. He lived in this time on earth. This guy who was walking through a wheat field, that guy was living on earth in congruity with the way he made the universe. And as he's doing that, we look at him and go, no, this isn't right. This is exactly what we didn't think was good. And so we decided it would be good to kill him. And even in that, he, out of his utter faithfulness, rises from the dead. It's like, you don't have power here. Rises from the dead, and then invites anyone and everyone who says, I want to follow him. He invites all of the people who have any desire to follow him to experience life and life abundantly. And everything that we're going to talk about today is because God has proven himself to be that way. All of what we're going to talk about today is not about us proving anything to him. I just want to be clear about that. All of what we're going to talk about today is because God has proven himself to be who he is. We are not going to be doing this from the context of us proving ourselves to God. And so when we talk about spiritual disciplines, it's one of those places where we can start to feel like, I got to prove myself to God. We talk about prayer. We talk about, prayer or Bible reading. It's like, okay, I got to have like 15 minutes in the morning or an hour in the morning. I'm supposed to read my Bible. Ellen White said, you should spend a thoughtful hour in meditation about the cross. And you're like, I did 5 minutes and it wasn't about the cross. It was, God, I really need help. Please help me. And then I left for work, right? Like that's what my day was. And so you start to feel like I'm not measuring up to what other people say. You hear it from the pulpit all the time. You should do this. You should do this. You should do this. You start feeling like I'm not measuring up to those things. So spiritual disciplines can start feeling like I got to prove myself to God. Many of us grew up in contexts where there was Sabbath keeping involved in Judaism and Seventh-day Adventism, even in other contexts. And what you picked up from that is proving ourselves to God. In fact, it starts to feel like, okay, there's this arbitrary commands that God makes, that this big guy in the sky makes. If I do them, then he'll feel approval about me. That feels good. I want my dad's approval. Okay, so dad approves of me. If I am the kind of kid he can approve of for long enough, then he'll take me to Disneyland when he goes. That's what it feels like for a lot of us. And even if you'd say, like, I've moved past that, so many of us have had so much of that ingrained in our lives that it's really hard for us to actually move past it. A lot of us are still stuck in that. The reason I say that is because many people I talk to that have grown up in Adventism, which is a special place in my heart. If you're not Adventist today, I'm just doing some stuff for the Adventists right now. If you've grown up in Adventism, I cannot tell you how many of the conversations I have end up in frustration, hurt, pain from all of the stuff we picked up. And people who are not living in those spaces anymore, in the traditional spaces that have hurt people, they're not living there anymore. But so many of us, it's the main thing we talk about when we talk about religion. And so that's why I say it can feel like I got to get dad's approval, and then if I get dad's approval enough and for long enough, he'll take me to Disneyland when he takes everybody else. But this is not about that. Spiritual disciplines are not about that. So as we talk about spiritual disciplines, let me just give you an idea of what they are. Spiritual disciplines are ways in which we offer ourselves to God consistently for him to meet us however he chooses to. Let me say that one more time. Spiritual disciplines are ways in which we offer ourselves to God consistently for him to meet us in them however he chooses to. What I mean by that is when we offer ourselves in prayer, it's a spiritual discipline. Sounds like a big word, spiritual discipline, but it's a spiritual discipline. It's something you do consistently. When I come in prayer to God, what I'm doing, if I'm doing it with a heart that is congruent with what these disciplines are about, I come to God and say, Lord, here's everything that's on my mind. Here's my time and my attention. You meet me here however you choose to. That's what it is. When we fast, as Pastor Phil was talking about last week, fasting is saying, listen, I could offer myself up to my desires to go wherever they lead me. But instead, I recognize that often my desires take me against the grain of the universe and I get splinters. So instead, I'm going to offer up my desires to God by abstaining from something, specifically food generally. I'm going to offer myself up to God. My appetite, my desires, I'm going to offer it up to God. God, you choose to meet me in this time of fasting however you choose to. And it may be that in that moment, God meets you in the most revelatory way you've ever experienced. It also may be that you don't really experience anything super different. But as you do that spiritual discipline consistently, one day you look back and you say, well, I'm different because the Holy Spirit has been doing stuff you didn't even see that whole time. That's what spiritual disciplines are. They are us offering up something to God, our time, our attention, our desires, whatever it might be, so he can do whatever he chooses to do. It's us saying, you get a foothold in my life. Instead of me going and offering myself up to everything else I could, you get a foothold in my life. And as we give God those footholds in our life, he starts to, in his gentle way, take it all over. That's what spiritual disciplines are. They're not built to have shame involved in them, and yet most of us have experienced it that way. And so today we're going to talk about Sabbath. one of the ones that has a ton of shame associated with it if you grew up in it. If you're somebody who didn't grow up with Sabbath and you're just coming to this for the first time, it's actually way better than the way I'm going to make it sound at times because of how so many people in this room have experienced it. But it is beautiful. It is good. If you're coming to it and you're like, I got some idea of what it is, or if you're coming to it as like, I actually really love Sabbath, all good. It will speak to you today. But I just want to say I have a special heart for anybody who's been hurt, burned, or just turned away by what Sabbath is. So what I wanted to do today is just talk a little bit about the story, the narrative to how we get to Sabbath and why it ends up being what it is. And then I want to talk about what it looks like to practice it today. Sound good? That's what we're going to do. And I just want to start off by going back to that story that we had mentioned earlier, which is Jesus walking through a wheat field, and now there's this tension because the Pharisees go, hey, why are your disciples picking grain on the Sabbath? That's against the law. And Jesus goes, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. There's a history. Like that doesn't happen out of a vacuum. Like we somehow got to this point where there's contention around this idea called Sabbath. And so just for anybody who doesn't know, Sabbath, 24-hour period, we do once a week. Once a week, that is a special day. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. So let's get into it. The narrative about Sabbath starts surprisingly and shockingly at the beginning of the Bible. That was sarcasm if you didn't know. Most stuff starts at the beginning of the Bible. So Sabbath starts right at the end of the first narrative about creation. So Genesis 1, and then we get to the beginning of Genesis 2. It's still part of that first narrative, and this is what it says. It says, the heavens and the earth were completed with everything that was in them. By the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing, and he ceased on the seventh day all the work that he had been doing. God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy because on it he ceased all the work that he had been doing in creation. Now, if you grew up with Sabbath, you're like, okay, that's Sabbath. If you didn't grow up with it, you're like, wait, what's the Sabbath thing? I don't see it in there. Well, what's actually cool about it is that Sabbath is in there because Sabbath is kind of a direct sort of English pronunciation of the Hebrew word, Shabbat, Sabbath. That's where we kind of get it, right? Well, what's cool about this is that word, the two words, he ceased. The way in Hebrew that you would read that is quo, which means he, Shabbat. He stopped. That's what Sabbath means. In case you didn't know, Sabbath means stop, done, stop it. That's what it means. He ceased all the work that he had been doing in creation. And so we get this thing where it seems like a really simple phrase. He just stopped, he was done, cool. But you start to recognize that the crowning achievement after the 6 days of creation was humanity, ended day 6. And he gets to day 7 after he's created a bunch of empty space. For the first 3 days, he's filled the empty space with living beings. They used to think that the heavenly, like stars, sun, moon, all that were living beings. So he fills the empty spaces with living things, crowning achievement, humans. And then he steps back and he's done. God is done creating. He said, I don't need to do more. I can be done. And most of us are like, I'm never done. I'm on a hamster wheel. God's like, I'm done. And you can see in just the idea of it being translated even as rest in other translations, that God looks at everything that he's made and he goes, yeah, this is good. He consistently says it's good. And so you imagine that God is enjoying what he made, that he's taken delight in what he's made. He's taken a day where he's like, I'm not going to do anything here because I'm done, and I'm going to just enjoy it. And you see in chapter 2, as it goes on, you'll find out that God takes walks in the garden with his people in the place that he made. God is enjoying and delighting in what he made. Pretty cool, right? Well, guess what happens, or guess the next time that you hear about Sabbath. It's the next page. No, I'm just kidding. It's thousands of years later in the narrative. You don't hear about Sabbath again for several thousand years, at least in the narrative. Well, what happens in between this moment and the next time we hear about Sabbath is that the humans do the whole thing where we didn't trust God. We decided to trust ourselves, go against the grain of humanity, or of the universe, all that stuff. And then God's like, okay, this is getting pretty bad. We're going to restart. So there's a flood. And after that, humans get scattered all over the earth. And God, because he's who he is and because he's faithful, he goes, I'm not done with you guys yet. And so he chooses one family This guy named Abraham, you and all your descendants, I'm going to choose you to be my special people. I'm going to bless you. You'll bless the world because of that. Okay, cool. Like now we're getting into God's like special people. Here, we're going to meet Sabbath. We just don't. The first three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, no mention of Sabbath. We get to Jacob's son, Joseph. He gets taken into slavery in Egypt, becomes the second in command, brings his whole family there. They get the best land in Egypt. Wild story. Sabbath isn't in it. A few generations later, a Pharaoh comes to power, looks at all these people and goes, these people are scary. I'm going to put them to work. Enslaves them for centuries. Sabbath's not mentioned. God shows up. He's like, yo, I see your suffering. I'm going to do something about it. Shows up, defeats the Pharaoh through like a series of just the wildest battles you've ever seen, takes his people out of Egypt, through a Red Sea, destroys Pharaoh's entire army. Sabbath nowhere to be found. The first place we get to Sabbath ever being mentioned outside of that original narrative is in Exodus chapter 16. And it's super random. They've been wandering in the desert for like a month and a half. And you can imagine, in the desert, you only have what you brought with you. And for most of us, if you're going on a flight, you pack some snacks. You're like, okay, cool, or you're going to pick up some like gummy worms or something at the little store in the airport. Cool. And then you get delayed on the tarmac for hours. I didn't plan for this. Except it's even worse because in that time, you don't have a backup. You don't have a go to the store type of thing. You have the animals that you brought with you. You have what they produce or what you can slaughter. You have water that you have to go find. You have maybe some people you could trade with in the area. That's it. Like life is tenuous at this point. And as a parent now, I'd be looking at the situation and feel like they do. They start to complain. They start to be like, I'm all for us being out of slavery, but my kids are going to starve to death. That's a problem. And they start, rightfully so, you'd think, to look back at Egypt and go, I know we were in slavery, but we had food. And they start complaining and they start being concerned about all this stuff. And God goes to their leader Moses and he's like, yo, I'm about to make it rain. I don't know if that's an appropriate context, but I'm going to make it rain bread from heaven. It's phrased like that. I'm going to rain bread down from heaven on these people. Funny enough, God doesn't actually rain it down. It forms as dew on the ground, bakes, and then it's the whole thing. But he decides, I'm going to give you bread every single day. Don't try and keep it overnight. It will spoil. Every single day you're going to get bread. And so this is what happens. So they gathered it each morning, each person according to what he could eat. And when the sun got hot, it would melt. And on the sixth day, they go outside and they gathered twice as much food. And 2 omers per person. And all the leaders of the community came and told Moses. They're like, what's happening? Because they had tried to keep it before. God got a little annoyed. He's like, guys, I told you not to keep it overnight. Some of y'all did. It got worms and it spoiled. Why are you doing this? Don't you trust me? Come on. I walked you through a sea on dry ground. I mean, come on. You should start trusting what I said. But they don't. But he still gives them bread every single day. And then all of a sudden one day they're like, hey, Moses, by the way, just FYI, there's twice as much food on the ground, just laying around. And this is what Moses says. He says, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a time of cessation. The word there is pretty much sabbatical, Sabbath, from work, a holy Shabbat Sabbath to the Lord. Whatever you want to bake, bake today. Whatever you want to boil, boil today. Whatever's left, put aside for yourselves to be kept until morning. And they're like, okay, that sounds weird. And they do it. And they keep it till the next day. And it doesn't spoil. Some of them, though, are like, okay, but what about tomorrow? And they go outside the tent. And they go looking around for bread. And God goes, guys, I told you not to keep it overnight because it would spoil. It did. I told you it's not going to happen tomorrow. It's just not. You got twice as much the day before. It's not happening tomorrow. And y'all left the tent. So he's like, you know what? Next week, don't even leave your house. Don't even leave your tent. That's actually the second command about Sabbath we get. It's going to be a cessation of work. Second command, come on. Okay, next week, don't leave. That's where Sabbath gets initiated. Out of nowhere. It's a story about manna. But all of a sudden we're like, oh, I guess Sabbath is happening. But when you start to look at it, you start to see that every single day, God had been providing for them. They had to trust every single day that bread would magically, and I mean magically, I mean, that would be crazy to us now, magically appears on the ground. You have to trust that God's going to take care of you every day. And then all of a sudden, one day, it's all going to switch. And you've got to trust that God's going to be faithful to who he is. You got to trust that this is what's wild about Sabbath, you have to trust that God has already provided for me and that he's going to continue to. This is a people who, again, life is tenuous, life is scary. This is a big deal. This is not just like, oh yeah, cool, everything's fine. This is just a normal day. No, this is scary. But this is what God says. This is the first Sabbath that we run into. And you just start to wonder to yourself, why is it instituted here, though? Most of us probably have heard the 10 Commandments. You get remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Wasn't that the institution of it? No, why was it instituted in this moment? Well, I think the narrative starts to answer it. Because some time goes by, they end up at a mountain. God happens to be sitting on the mountain, crazy. And Moses goes up to meet him. And God starts to give him a series of rules or laws. Hey, listen, I've delivered you. You're going to be my people, and I will be your God. And let's figure this relationship out. And so he starts to give him a series of, here's what it looks like to live in congruity in your culture and time now. Here's what it looks like to live in congruity with the way that I built this whole thing. And so the first three are all about these people's relationship with God. The last six are all about their relationship with one another. Right in the middle of it, you get number 4, which is the longest of all of them. And it's the only one that's like a spiritual discipline, which is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It says this here. So remember the Sabbath day to set it apart as holy. For 6 days you may labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your cattle or the resident foreigner who is in your gates. 4, and this is where we get the why, because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. Here's what's interesting. We get a why here for why Sabbath is even a thing that they keep. And it's connected back, this first big command about it gets connected back to the first mention of it in the entire Bible. God created. The reason we do this is because God said, I can stop. I'm not on the hamster wheel. And in fact, I can enjoy life. I can take delight in the reality of what is directly in front of me. It doesn't have to be any more or any less. I can take joy in what it is right now. And that's an invitation to them to do the same. That's the why. But then a whole series of events happens. They keep going against the grain of the universe. And after a few generations have to die off, they end up about to go into the promised land. And before they go in, Moses, after all this other stuff that happens, he goes, okay, guys, let's talk through this again because it didn't go well before. Let's talk through this again. And so we get to Deuteronomy chapter 5, where he goes back over the 10 Commandments. And this is what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Be careful to observe the Sabbath day, just as the Lord your God has commanded you. You are to work and do all your tasks in 6 days. Sounds pretty like the one before. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. And on that day, you must not do any work. You, your son, your daughter, your male slave, your female slave, your ox, your donkey, and any other animal or the resident foreigner who lives with you. We've been through all of that before, but then he adds this. So that your male and female slaves like yourself may have rest. And there's 2 reasons that this is probably included. The first is because it's transitioning to what we're going to read next. But the second is about justice. Because what this seems to hint at is in this time in between these 2 commands, people have been taking Shabbat for themselves, but the vulnerable in their household, their slaves, have not been afforded the same reality. And this is Moses being like, I see you. Don't do that. But then we're about to get in a completely different why. You ready? Recall that you were slaves in the land of Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there by strength and power. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Wait, so now we get 2 whys. The first one in Exodus 20 gets connected back to the first mention of Sabbath in the narrative. It's because God stopped. He wasn't on the hamster wheel. He delighted in the way things were in the moment. He was good with that. You do the same, you're invited to. But now we get it getting tied back, the second command getting tied back to the second time it's mentioned. It says, remember you were slaves. So let's go back to Exodus 16, a month and a half removed from being slaves. And God goes, here's Sabbath. And I think that the reason that this is a reason for keeping Sabbath is because when you were a slave, you don't get Sabbath, first of all. You were at the whim of whatever the people above you want you to do. You were a tool, a robot for their use. That's it. And when you're in that space, you can just imagine that I never get a day off. I'm constantly, ground to dust in this reality. And then you get free. And you're like, yeah, freedom. And then you get out and you experience the reality of freedom. How many of you graduated from college and you're like, I'm not ready for this. Nobody told me how to adult. I wasn't given those skills. And you start to realize, now I have all the freedom in the world, and that's a little bit terrifying. You get out of slavery, you get into all this freedom, but now I've got to survive. If I don't take care of my animals, they're going to die, and we don't have food. So I got to do that. If I don't make sure they're reproducing at a rate that's going to be sustainable for the long run, well, then I got to make sure they can reproduce at that rate. I got to go find water. I got to make sure my kids are taken care of. I got to make sure all the meals are happening. I've got to make sure that people don't take my stuff. I've got to make sure. And all of a sudden, you start to realize that they were in slavery in Egypt, but now they're in slavery to their own survival, having to do everything on their own because they are the only ones responsible for their own lives at this point. And God says to them, no, you're not. You were slaves there. You are not to be slaves out here. I'm your dad. I've got you. I am your God. I've got you. I'm your king. I'm going to provide for you. And then he does it. And then you get to Sabbath and God goes, okay, by the way, today I have already provided for you. You're trusting in that today. I've already given you everything you could possibly need. And I will continue to be that way for the rest of my time with you. That's why, remember, you were slaves. First of all, remember you were slaves, so don't treat your slaves the way you have been. But also remember you were slaves once, so don't be in slavery to all of the things that it takes to survive. Because I've got you. But think about this, that was back then, when they're scrounging to survive. What's wild about how humans have experienced life over the last few decades is we have increased human lifespans by a wild amount. I kid you not, up until, I think somewhere in the 1800s, the average human lifespan was 40. We're up at like in the mid-70s here. It's wild how much more life on average people have. It's wild how much we have given to us. I can go to the store right now and get something that is not good for me. And I can just do that because I can, because there's a whole support system that gets them there on trucks, all that stuff. I have everything I could ever need. And anxiety and depression and suicide rates have massively increased. Because at one point, you're part of a society and you're struggling to survive, and that's terrifying, and you're all responsible to make sure that you guys survive, but there's some teamwork to that. Now, we have existential threats. If I don't figure out my purpose today, I'm going to waste tomorrow and the next day and next year, and then all of a sudden I'm going to be a job I hate, and then I'm going to be 40, and I'm going to hate my life. If I don't find somebody now, I'm going to leave this place, and it's going to be a desert out anywhere else. I'm going to be alone. There's existential crisis that we have, and that's just the beginning. Will I ever be liked for who I truly am? Yet I'm also on social media putting out a version of myself that's not truly who I am. I'm not trying to harp on the things that we have today because it's just a reality that we've walked into. My point is that the things that we have faced become existential. They become these massive things we cannot solve. And God now, even more so than even then, is like, I've got you. I'm inviting you to not be a slave to all of that. That's why Sabbath ends up being so deeply important. That's what he's inviting us to. That's why he instituted. He said, the why behind keeping Sabbath is because I created and then I stopped. I wasn't on a hamster wheel. You take time to enjoy life and delight in what it is now. And also you have been delivered from having to be a slave to all of that other stuff. Stay free. That's what Sabbath, Shabbat, is about. Now, I want to tell you something. For anybody who has experienced the pain, and this is going to be kind of directed towards people who have experienced a poor version of Sabbath, who haven't experienced it in a way that was attractive or maybe even was traumatizing. I'm going to list all of the commands about Sabbath, all the different commands. Some of them are repeated. I'm going to list all of the commands about Sabbath that exist in Scripture. It's going to take about 2 hours. I'm just kidding. It's not going to do that. I'm going to list all of the commands so that you know what you're dealing with when you look back at your past and say, this is what I experienced Sabbath as. This is what people told me Sabbath was. You ready? Here's what we're going to do. Sabbath commands. Here's the first one. Stay in your tent, okay? That was the one that was like, hey, listen, guys, you keep going outside. You're not trusting me. Stay in your tent, okay? So you've got a tent. I'm watching y'all. The next one is no work and keep it holy. This is the main one we see consistently and over again. Okay, so this is the one that's like absolute. You're going to see it all over the place when it's mentioned, when Sabbath is mentioned. The next one is a really fun one. Put to death those who intentionally break it. So tomorrow after Sabbath is over, the crazy thing about this is that this only ever happens once in the narrative, and it's because a guy in the narrative is shown to intentionally be breaking it. And at that time, when all the community has agreed, this is our pact between us and God, and when you don't have the same ways of like we can throw someone in prison or on parole or whatever it is, you don't have that, the culture and the way you deal with those things completely different. But it only ever happens once in the narrative. Pretty interesting. The next one is keep it even in the busiest of seasons. The reference here is, I want you to keep the Sabbath day, keep it holy, even in planting and harvest. And if you think about this, if you're planting and all of a sudden it's sundown on Friday, you're like, I've got to keep going. Like, I've got to finish the couple rows I have left. No, you stop, you finish it on the first day. You finish it on Sunday. But then you get to harvest. If I don't harvest this and it hails tomorrow, it's all gone. No, don't do it. Wait till Sunday. Even in the busiest of seasons, keep Sabbath. Okay, so that's that one. Don't build a fire. So when you're camping, you're just going cold, okay? This one we don't fully understand. It's mentioned once. In fact, the guy who gets killed, he was kind of breaking this one sort of, and we don't really have a lot of context for it, and it seems like it was kind of in a specific time around some specific things that were happening. So that one's interesting. And then offer some special sacrifices on Sabbath, which is mainly, I think, for the priests. Okay, ready for number 7? There isn't one, at least in the law. That's all of them. When you get to the prophets, you're going to get a little bit of a different, you're going to get one time where the prophet Jeremiah is talking to people. So now this is the people of Israel after so long. They have been living, they've kept going away from God and experiencing the consequences of it. And he has this whole poetic narrative where he goes, don't carry loads through the gates of Jerusalem or out of your house. And he keeps harping on, like several times, don't carry loads through the gates of Jerusalem. What he means is you're breaking the Sabbath and you're walking through the gates of Jerusalem, and then he ties it into, well, now you're going to become more and more like the rest of the world. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. So you have this whole thing where there's all these people who want to take you out. God would have been your protector. You don't want him. So now another nation is going to come and they're going to burn the very gates you broke the Sabbath through. So that command isn't necessarily even a universal command because he's tying it into a poetic narrative. But even then, 2 things. Don't carry the load out of your house. Put it outside your house and then you're good, right? As long as you don't put it outside the day before and then carry it out after that, right? You're good then, right? And don't carry it through the gates of Jerusalem just in case you happen to be there on Sabbath, okay? And then we have one more thing, which isn't even a command. It's the return to exile. So after all of that, after the gates get burned, they get taken to exile, they come back, and together they commit and they say, hey, listen, we're not going to buy things from the foreigners that come into Jerusalem to sell on Saturday. They don't actually hold to it. But that's what they commit to. Not even a command to us. They decide, we're not going to do that. And that's where so many of us get the don't buy, don't sell. That's it. And for anybody who's been hurt, damaged, told that Sabbath was all of these specific things, can I just tell you, all of the things that you were told was someone interpreting what Sabbath should be. Was a human interpreting what it meant to not work. Was a human saying to you, this is the way that God said it is, when that wasn't really the way. I'm not saying everything you're told wasn't a good thing to do. I just want you to know this is exactly what God did say, or at least the narrative says. So when we think about Sabbath, I want you to just look at this. Let's see, offer some special sacrifices. We don't do that anymore. Don't build a fire, kind of contextual. Put to death those who intentionally break it. I mean, we can if we want, but stay in your tent. All of those things we wouldn't do today. So you got two things left on there. No work and keep it holy, and keep it even in the busiest of season. And that's for commands. So what if you get to start from scratch? And what if there's a whole world of beauty about Sabbath that you can discover, but you don't have to do it with the you should. You have to. And so let's talk about what we do today. It's kind of three areas that I would suggest from Scripture and from a lot of other people who've done a lot more study on Sabbath than I've done, that we should Sabbath from. And so the first one is Sabbath from what dominates. This is where you get really into the work and the don't work on Sabbath, or set it apart as a different day. When he says set it apart as holy, what that really means is set it apart and above all the other days. So Sabbath from what dominates. For each of us, that looks entirely different. For those of you who are students in here, who are studying like 24, 26 hours a day, 26 hours doesn't exist, just in case I need to explain that joke. You're living in a world where you're on the hamster wheel of, I just have to do this or else. If that's what dominates your week, on Sabbath, be free. Be free. Not you should be free. Be free. You have been delivered. You have a God who's going to take care of you. Be free. If for you work dominates and it happens to be maybe you're self-employed and it's what you're doing all the time consistently, don't do anything that feels like that. If you send emails all the time, don't send emails. If you're somebody who's I got to read all the time, I got to write report. If the reading feels like you're grading paper, don't do it. Rest from what dominates the rest of your week. That's what you're being invited to. If we're just looking at that, don't work. Just don't worry about it. Not because you should, but because you're invited to. And that's what this next one is. Sabbath from should. This one sounds wild, but I say it because it's deeply important. Shame originates most often in should. I should be nicer. I should read my Bible more. I ought to. That causes so much shame in our lives. I just want to share this with you. You don't have to start there. If God said, I stopped, I rested, I am inviting you to do the same. I'm inviting you to enjoy life as it is. Not as it should be someday. Not as what you ought to be doing instead. I'm just inviting you to come enjoy it as it is. Do that with God. Sabbath from the should. Sabbath from the, I really should read my Bible more. Maybe after you Sabbath from that for a while, maybe all of a sudden you go, I kind of want to read my Bible today. Don't even have the goal though. Just Sabbath from the should. And instead enjoy life with God as it is. Another thing about Sabbathing from should is also about Sabbathing from, let me put it this way, should causes a lot of anxiety in our lives. I should be farther along. I should be with that person. I should have it all figured out. I should. And you start to get all of this anxious energy in your life because you're like, I should be. Sabbath from all of those shoulds. I should have more money in my bank account. You have what you have. And today, God says, I've given you what I have given you, and I will give you what I give you. Today is not the day. It's a day you don't have to worry about that. I should be farther along. You don't have to know what happens tomorrow. Today, just live today. It's a Sabbath it's a ceasing, it's a stopping, all the stuff that causes the anxious energy. It's an invitation. It's not a you should. If you come out of this and you go, oh, I shouldn't be anxious, you're doing it wrong. It's going to cause more anxiety. Me saying you're doing it wrong might even cause anxiety. Anyways, the last one, Sabbath from distraction. Sabbath from distraction. Sabbath from distraction. This isn't a harping on social media or our phones or anything like that. But I will say this. Distraction is the way most of us deal with the world as it is. I don't want to deal with the fact that I'm in an elevator alone with someone I don't know. Save me. I don't want to deal with the fact that there's like this creeping anxiety or depression in my life, so I'm going to hole up in my room and just not deal. We have so many ways that we distract ourselves. I'm going to binge watch an entire season, which is not bad. Not bad to do. But sometimes we're using it as an avoidance to other stuff in our lives that's important. The invitation to Sabbath from distraction is an invitation to lean into life as it is with God. That's what it's an invitation to do. It's an invitation to lean in. This is what life really is. Some of it's scary, some of it's awesome. Lean into it with God. What's so cool about this is there's some things for us that aren't distracting. In fact, I love sci-fi. If you love sci-fi, like novels, read a sci-fi novel on Sabbath. And let me just tell you something really cool about this. Do it with God. That sounds weird and crazy because of how many of us grew up. But do it. If you enjoy it, if it's something that's like, man, I feel so refreshed after this, do it. And then afterwards be like, God, that was wild. When that guy, he flipped the ship around and he shot, that was wild. Just do it with God. That's the biggest thing about this whole thing. Anything you do with God. That's it. Sabbath from those things, but do it with God. Go on a walk. If you're somebody who's always distracted, you're like, I'm always on my phone, turn your phone off. Put it away. Go on a walk and look at the world as it is. The leaves, the people. Look at that person and go, God, you have loved that person since before I ever laid eyes on them. I wonder what it's been like to love them. You've loved me the same way. All of a sudden, you're deep in the way the world really is in that moment. That's the invitation, to do it with God. Sabbath will come for you. It will come for you either as delight or it will come for you as discipline. That's what John Mark Comer says. Sabbath will come for you either way. It's going to come as delight or it's going to come as discipline. And the reason that we say that is because you either Sabbath and you have some space, some freedom to be able to exist in the way that God has built the universe, or you burn yourself out and you have to quit. Or you have a mental break because you just can't handle everything you're putting yourself through. Or you have the biggest anxiety attack you've ever had, and you have to take time away. Or you get sick week after week after week because your immune system's like, what are you doing to me? It's not condemnation. It's just understanding that God built us in a way that we can absolutely fight against if we want, but we will get the splinters. And so when Jesus goes, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. For some of us, it's the invitation to recognize the first part. The Sabbath was made for me. Maybe I should try it. For some of us, it's the second part. Not man for the Sabbath. I don't have to fit into the box that everybody else has tried to create. Instead, Sabbath, and whatever you do it with him. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you so much that you made this for us. And we're going to go on a journey, some of us, of reconstructing and deconstructing and then reconstructing. Some of us are going to start some stuff and we're going to be like, I'm going to go shopping today because I enjoy it. And then we're going to realize at the end of that, man, I only feel like I consumed. We're going to try other stuff. We're going to get some stuff right, some stuff wrong, Lord, but you have been faithful through everything. So we trust that you will be. We trust that you're going to bring us to a place as we consistently offer up these parts of our lives, as we offer up a 24-hour period to you, that you're going to be faithful and you're going to teach us over the long period of time that we do it, what it feels like to truly exist in the joy of it. So wherever you take us, Lord, your prerogative. Love in your name. Amen.